You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio. Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now, your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Koku here with you, presenting another reading of a paper. And this is it's important for me to mention this early. You'll see in the pinned comment in the chat, check out the Revolutionary Matron's deep reading of David Walker's Appeal. And there's the link. So make sure you guys check out the newest show on KWAZ Radio, the Revolutionary Matron. Check out the deep reading that she's been doing of David Walker's Appeal. All right, and so don't just check this show. Don't just check this episode out. But check out her show as well. Make sure you like, comment, subscribe, click the bell to be notified when she's on again. So make sure to check her out. Also check out the Pro-Black Perspective for the month of August. He's reading Monday through Friday. He's reading Wretched of the Earth, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So you guys check him out as well, right? But because I'm presenting on David Walker's Appeal, make sure follow the link in the pinned comment in the chat. Make sure to go over and read. And listen to her episodes on David Walker's Appeal. All right, for those, especially those of you who've never read the document before, make sure to go check out her recent episodes. All right. I want to remind you guys while I'm at it that this show is a part of a podcast network called KWAZ Radio. There are other shows on the network you should be checking out, like Pro-Black Perspective, who's in the chat room saying peace fam, Revolutionary Matron, who's in the chat room saying greetings. Also check out the Harsh Reality Podcast and do all the things like, subscribe, share their content. Okay, make sure to comment on their content as well. All right, let them know that you've been listening. You know, I got a great message from a brother on the Discord. Don't forget to join the Discord as well. The link is in the description. This brother, Anago Ogun, was telling me how he listened to the episode on the Radical Pan-African Itinerary. In fact, I think he said he listened to it twice, and he loved the paper on Western and African communitarianism, a comparison. So that just goes to show, you know, that brother is showing that he is actually tuning in and listening, right? And he also donated to the show as well. If you want to donate to the show, Cash App, $ Bitter Meds, MEDZ. That's the kind of thing I want you all to do on all the other shows on the network as well, right? Much appreciation. Okay. Now we got the business out of the way, let's get to the business of this reading. All Embracing Black Nationalist Theories of David Walker's Appeal by Thabiti Asukile, or Asukile. Sterling Stuckey is a prolific historian who has written extensively about American 19th century Black nationalism. His writings on the influence of David Walker's Appeal on 19th century Black nationalist theory have been viewed as original and controversial. In his introduction to the collection of essays, The Ideological Origins of Black Nationalism, Editor Stuckey postulates quote, indeed, it is likely that his appeal to the colored citizens of the world contains the most all-embracing black nationalist formulation to appear in America during the 19th century, end of quote. 15 years later, in Slave Culture, Black Nationalist Theory and Foundations of Black America, he concludes, quote, he, meaning Walker, is the father of Black nationalist theory in America, because much of the substance of that ideology is found in his writings, despite the sometimes disjointed way in which he presented his views, end of quote. Stuckey's exegesis of David Walker's appeal is thought-provoking. And as we shall discover in our examination of it, it is something that must be taken seriously, whether one agrees or disagrees with him, that Walker is the father of Black nationalist theory in America. How many of you listening would agree that Walker is the father of Black nationalist theory in America? David Walker's unexpected appeal, first published in 1829, caused much controversy for white abolitionists, slave holders, and those who shared pro-slavery sentiments in America. So the brother wrote the appeal in almost 200 years ago. Wow. The appeal was one of America's most important pieces of literature written during the 19th century. Walker was born on September 28th, 1785, in Wilmington, North Carolina. His father was an enslaved African who died a few months before his son's birth, and his mother was a free woman of African ancestry. Walker grew up to despise the system of slavery that the American government allowed in America. He knew the cruelties of slavery were not for him and said, quote, if I remain in this bloody country land, I will not live long. As true as God reigns, I will be avenged for the sorrow which my people have suffered. It's not the place for me. No, no, I must leave this part of the country. The first appearance of Walker's appeal in September 1829 was followed by 3 more editions between 1829 to 1830. It was considered subversive, seditious, and incendiary for most white men in North America and southern states. Walker was concerned about many social issues affecting free and enslaved Africans in America during the antebellum era. He also expressed many future Black nationalist aims and sentiments, such as the unified struggle for resistance of oppression, slavery, the issue of land reparations, the concept of people of African descent in America governing themselves, racial pride, criticisms of American capitalism. Some excerpts from the appeal will give some indication of the issues that concern Walker and of his sense of grave racial injustice. So here's a quote. I have therefore come to the immovable conclusion that they, meaning Americans, have and do continue to punish us for nothing else but for enriching them and their country, millions of whom are to this day so ignorant and avaricious that they cannot conceive how God can have an attribute of justice and show mercy to us because it pleased him to make us black, which color Mr. Jefferson calls unfortunate, as though we are not as thankful to our God for having made us as it pleased himself as they, the whites, for having made them white. I asked those people who treat us so well, I asked them, where is the most barren spot of land which they have given to us? Can a man of color buy a piece of land and keep it peaceably? Will not some white man try to get it from him, even if it is in a mud hole? Our suffering will come to an end, in spite of all the Americans this side of eternity. But we will want all the learning and talents among ourselves, and perhaps more, to govern ourselves. Are we men? I ask you, O my brethren, are we men? Did our Creator make us to be slaves to dust and ashes like ourselves? Are they not dying worms as well as we? The Appeal was probably one of the most controversial tracts written during the antebellum era in America. Walker's call for the emancipation of enslaved Africans in America was indeed needed, although most people would not call Walker himself a black nationalist because the term and the ideology had not yet been developed, and also because he did not call for the creation of a sovereign black nation state through political or militant struggle. His appeal would become an ideological foundation for what Sterling Stuckey interprets as black nationalist theory. The Ideological Origins of Black Nationalism, edited by Stuckey, focuses on the writings of men of African descent in America who at some time in their lives expressed black nationalist sentiments and ideas during the antebellum era. Robert Alexander Young, David Walker, Augustine, or I guess it was Lewis Woodson, Henry Highland Garnett, and Martin Delany. However, before examining Stuckey's concept of black nationalism, one should be aware that there is some variation in the definition among scholars of the term black nationalism in America. Some definitions emphasize cultural autonomy, while others also emphasize the struggle to establish a black nation state on American soil. For example, Wilson J. Moses writes about what he defines as classical black nationalism, which he says originated in the 1700s and lasted well into the 1920s. He asserts, quote, classical black nationalism, which reached its fullest expression in the years from 1850 to 1925, may be defined as the effort of African Americans to create a sovereign nation state, formulate an ideological basis for a concept of a national culture. To E.U. Eisen Udom, black nationalism, quote, may be thought of as the belief of a group that it possesses or ought to possess a country, that shares or ought to share a common heritage of language, culture, and religion, and that its heritage, way of life, and ethnic identity are distinct from those of other groups. How do you guys feel about that definition? I think that definition resonates pretty well, right? It should also be stressed that defining antebellum liberation ideology as black nationalism is problematic, because many free Africans in America during that era were not overly concerned with defining ideological appellations while fighting for liberation. The introduction to the ideological origins of black nationalism, Sterling Stuckey postulates that black nationalist ideology during the antebellum era was linked to African tradition and humanity, that the Africans' experience in America forced them to become a new people, to explain why he avoided using different categories to define antebellum ideological black nationalism. So here's a quote from the work. The author wants to suggest at this point that the originators of the ideology that we refer to as black nationalism emphasized the need for black people to rely primarily on themselves in vital areas of life: economic, political, religious, and intellectual, in order to affect their liberation. Right? In order to affect their liberation. As formulated by Afro-American ideologists of the 1830s and later by Sidney in the 1840s, this attitude probably owed more to African traditions of group hegemony, which persisted in some forms during slavery, than to any other models from European thought or experience. The tendency, for example, for the earliest ideological nationalists to leap beyond the limits of Afro-America to embrace the totality of African humanity includes their elemental and instinctual recoil from the constraints of a narrow nationalism, a development made possible by the strange detribalizing process, which enabled black people for the first time in their history to think of the oneness of African peoples and to perceive the whole of the African continent as a single entity. First time in history to think of the oneness of African peoples. I'm not sure about that line. I have deliberately avoided the various categories of black nationalism which have been coined in our times: cultural nationalism, revolutionary nationalism, and so on. I have done so with respect to revolutionary nationalism because in antebellum America, almost any form of advocacy of black control was revolutionary. While I attribute very great importance to the cultural dimension, I avoid the term cultural nationalism precisely because the nationalism included in this volume stopped short of an ideology of cultural nationalism, which in fact did not come into America until the emergence of W.E.B. Du Bois at the turn of the century. Had a nationalist of antebellum America realized the enormous importance of black culture, had he been cognizant of its radical opposition to the culture of the larger society, that awareness, articulated into theory, would have been as revolutionary a development as calling for a massive uprising. That's interesting. So, before Garvey, here's a question to you. Before Garvey was really hammering home the point of Africa for the Africans, etc. As far as you guys can remember through your own readings, were there many African voices in America that were urging folks to close ranks around an African culture? Is there any significant readings that the listeners can plug into that you guys are aware of? But there were Africans in America, right? Because it wasn't Booker T. Were there Africans in America who were really talking about like embrace your African culture, reject the European one, right? Was there any Africans in your memories, in your research, in your readings that did that? Let's make sure I get the likes up. Let's get the likes to equal the number of viewers we have live right now, please. In the chat room, Pro Black Perspective earlier said peace fam. Revolutionary Matron said greetings. Pro Black Perspective says, yeah, Matron's readings are great. Absolutely. Revolutionary Matron says, I think that Walker and Paul Kufe are the forgotten fathers of Pan-Africanism. Revolutionary Matron goes on and said, black children should know this and not have to find this in college, if then. KW Don 7 answers the question. He says Martin Delaney did. Pro Black Perspective says maybe Martin Delaney promoted Africa. All right. So KW Don 7, by the way, peace to you, brother, for being here again. You say Martin Delaney. Do you have any passages you can point, or a book or what have you, to the listener? Because the reason I asked that question is maybe that is the fundamental reason why you have so much Africans in America who are shunning anything to do with Africa, because this is something that never was targeted, right? And Africans of old in America, post-slavery, right? Now, we know that there are things that are done that are definitely of an African origin, right? We know that there's things that we know. You go to Louisiana or something like that, Florida, etc. You're gonna see Africans in those parts of America doing things that directly point you towards the continent. But there's a difference in carrying on an activity that was brought over with the enslaved and those who have a cultural consciousness, a cultural nationalism, right? And maybe, and just in my early thoughts right now, maybe that's why. Because even in Garvey's time, there were folks who didn't want to be called African, right? Who didn't want to really be associated with Africa. Similar to today. Maybe that's a part of the reason why, right? Where was I? Where was it? I completely forgot. Let me just read this again. I apologize if I read this already. In the ideological origins of Black nationalism, Sterling Stuckey emphasizes six important points that should not go unnoticed when examining the early ideological formations of Black nationalism in America. First, the hope for Black autonomy existed as far back as the 17th century. Second, the sentiments and ideas of Black nationalism, as expressed by Walker's Appeal, existed at least 2 decades before Martin Delany formed his idea of a separate Black nation state in 1852. Third, as late as the 1820s, most people of African descent referred to themselves as Africans or free Africans. So that's interesting, right? That's because they're claiming most people. Now I know that there were those, I don't know if it was most, many, or some, but there was those who didn't want to be attached to Africa. Afro Jam is here in the room. Afro Jam says Alexander Crummell advocated for Africans in America to circle their wagons around African culture. Okay. Okay. As Stuckey asserts, they consider themselves Africans even as they made distinctions in the degree of civilization between themselves and their people in the ancestral home. Okay. Fourth, the terms Black nationalists are integrationists should not be applied to certain 19th century people who fought for Africans to be free in America. So this could hinder one in understanding major movements and ideologies of their time. Fifth, most of the people who shared Black nationalist ideas or sentiments sometime in their lives desired that they could live in America with the hope that Africans in America could control their own destinies. Six, that early 19th century Black nationalists often did not connect with nor appreciate African slave culture in America. Although they fought for the liberation of African people, many of them were culturally Anglophiles. They were proud of the glorious history of their ancestors on the African continent, but they neither appreciated nor understood African culture in America or in Africa. What percentage of Africans in America, what percentage of Africans in America today, right, to this day, do you think embrace an African ideology and an appreciation for African culture, right? What percentage do you think of Africans in America have that understanding and that appreciation, right? To continue. Sterling Stuckey's critique of Walker's Appeal in his introduction to the ideological origins of black nationalism would become polemical material for some scholars who find it problematic to call the appeal a black nationalist document. Stuckey's assessment, the appeal was a harbinger of all black nationalist ideology from the mid-19th century through the 20th century. Stuckey's view, as quoted earlier, Walker's appeal contains the most all-embracing black nationalist formulation to appear in America during the 19th century. Indeed, there is scarcely an important aspect of Afro-American nationalist thought in the 20th century which is not prefigured in that document. He also concerned himself with the question of why the appeal was not considered a black nationalist document, a question why many scholars did not acknowledge its importance during the 19th century. He asserted perhaps, quote, perhaps the main reason for this has been the emphasis devoted to Walker's cry for people to rise up, destroy the oppressors, an attention which serves to obscure the nationalist dimension of the appeal. Right? What does that mean? Does that mean people avoided it because they were afraid of the truth of it? Right? The pro-black perspective says 5%. That is god-awful. That is god-awful. Revolutionary Matron says, I think that less than 15% embrace, appreciate, accept, and want to integrate with African culture. Less than 15%. I would take 15%, but 5% is, you know, in science, they consider 5% a negligible difference. So it's almost non-existent. KW-7 says Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington both tried to distance themselves from Africa, and both were the product of miscegenation. That's true. Revolutionary Matron earlier said, were they all on a mission to civilize Africa instead of integrate with Africa? Afro Jam says the actual back to Africa moment was in the 1800s, not Garvey's time. The Revolutionary Matron says the oneness of Africa as a culture, religious and social entity is not an idea that I ever heard about outside of God. All right, 5%. That's not good. And I'm sure that's largely because most folks would only get their education about such things in the public school system, right? And that's why. And you know what really gets me is like, there's an age that we all reach in life. I call it the age of reason. The Catholic Church has an age of reason too, but I call it the age of reason. There's a time, and there's a few of them actually in our lifetime, right? But there's an age of reason in your 20s where, honestly, as a black person, you should want to. It should just, that fire should be in you to just want to look into Africa, right? Understand where it is your ancestors came from. Who were they? What were they like? You know, what similarities do you carry? And it's dumbfounding to see how many of us just don't give a shit. Carbon dark matter. First time I'm seeing carbon dark matter here. He says, peace and power, I will catch the rebroadcast. Great job. Well, I appreciate that. Hopefully you give me a like in the meantime, right? Let's get those likes up, right? To continue, indeed, before the 1960s, the appeal appears to have received very little attention among academics. Within the last 20 years, however, much has been written about David Walker and the appeal. And with the recent release of Peter Hink's To Awaken My Afflicted Brethren, David Walker and the Problem of Antebellum Slave Resistance, there will definitely become more discourse among academicians. Stuckey's central position on the appeal was that Walker called for the establishment of a black nation. He stated, quote, "There is nonetheless a comprehensiveness of approach, a penetrating insight, and a daring conception regarding the need for Africans to rule themselves, which mark his appeal as unmistakably nationalist in ideology." Stuckey cited the same quote that historian Vincent Harding used in There Is a River, the Black Struggle for Freedom in America, to support his view that Walker believed in the destiny of a black nation. In another reference to the need for black hegemony, he could not have been more explicit. Quote, "Our suffering will come to an end, despite all the Americans this side of eternity. Then we will want all the learning and talents among ourselves, and perhaps more, to govern ourselves." If you've been following pro-black perspective, reading Wretched of the Earth, a major part of his discussion has been this idea that black folks, Africans, never gave up colonial rule. They just substituted themselves as the faces of it, right? And so the issue around even this quote is that you got to be very clear on how it is we're supposed to go about governing ourselves. And the reality of it is, and here's where I think we failed in our independence movements in the past. We didn't really know what we were going to do. We didn't know how we were going to govern. So many of those early leaders who were also educated in the colonial way, they just copied what was already happening. And the few who went against it, they went against it using another European ideology, right? And so the time is now, and the time has been now, that we got to really start talking about, and I'm talking about we got to get our intellectuals together. And we really got to start talking about, you know, how will we govern ourselves? We have to really know what that looks like. We can't be haphazard about this. We can't talk about building nations and all this stuff, and we don't know how we're going to support the nation. We don't know how we're going to support and protect and even provide for the people of the nation. But we really got to start talking about that stuff now. So I hope you guys will join in that conversation, those conversations, like with the pro-black perspective, and talk in his covering, his deep reading of the Wretched of the Earth. We got to start talking about that stuff, man. Right now, all we talk about is capitalism ain't it. Socialism ain't it. So what is it? And we really got to start getting, you know, people who have the right mindset involved, right? People who could work those numbers out, etc. Right? This is where think tanks come in to play. I talked about think tanks in a whole episode. If you haven't checked it out, go look through the catalog. I talked about the think tank, and that's what the Discord is supposed to be. I would dare say the Discord that the pro-black perspective has, that's what that's supposed to be too, I would assume, right? Folks got to be talking about, instead of just critiquing shit, let's critique to build some stuff, right? Anyway, to continue. Did Walker primarily call for the establishment of a black nation? That appears to be Stuckey's view in the Ideological Origins of Black Nationalism. But he had significantly modified his analysis by the time he published Slave Culture, Nationalist Theory, and the Foundations of Black America. It appears likely that those scholars who criticized Stuckey for placing too much emphasis on the appeal as a black nationalist document, and who say that he ignores Walker's ideal of an integrated society, may have missed his analysis in Slave Culture. It is in Slave Culture that one can appreciate the intellectual insight of Stuckey as a scholar, and will find that he tremendously expands his exegesis of Walker's appeal. In Slave Culture, Stuckey contends that black nationalist theory originated in the African slave culture during the antebellum era. He explains that certain nationalist thinkers failed to appreciate the strength and the liberating potential of African slave culture when trying to fight for the liberation of enslaved Africans. So here's an excerpt. Much of this book is a study of irony because of the depths of African culture in America have been greatly underestimated by most nationalist theorists in America. Moreover, most were exposed to main currents of African culture without understanding how these currents might contribute to the surge toward liberation they wanted to achieve. Yet the work of nationalist theories on problems of slave culture, as we shall see, ultimately went far toward reconciling the theory and practice of black culture in America. Let me ask a question for you guys listening live with me. How would you define slave culture? How would you guys define slave culture? To continue, Stuckey contends that enslaved Africans in America were united together by new cultural circumstances that confronted them. They were able to overcome tremendous cultural background differences between them and essentially become a new African people in America. So you hear this a lot today, that, you know, the ADOS and the FBA crew, they talk about being their own ethnic group, separate from any Africans, that they are a new people in America. How many of you, you can just type 1 if you want to, would agree that Africans in America are a new African people, a separate ethnic group, etc.? Stuckey postulates that this was a new African nationalism, consisting of values that bound slaves together and sustained them under brutal conditions. In reality, this Pan-Africanization phenomenon was the beginning of a new African genius that would become what Stuckey believes was the truest, richest form of black nationalist theory. The Denmark-Vesey conspiracy of 1822, Charleston, South Carolina, is used in slave culture as an example to illustrate how Africans were changed into a new people. Denmark-Vesey was a freedman who was hanged with 34 other blacks for leading a conspiracy for a slave revolt in Charleston and its environs. Charleston was a city where the majority of the population was African because of the great influx of enslaved Africans transported from Africa during 1800 to 1807. They outnumbered white Americans considerably, and for the most part created a new African culture that most whites did not recognize or witness. It was this Pan-African environment that would shape Vesey's ideological struggle for African liberation. Vesey was a leader in the Charleston African Methodist Episcopal Church, or the AME Church, which was formed by Morris Brown in 1818. The AME members had earlier broken away from the white population-based Methodist Episcopalian Church because of burial disputes. With this break, the Africans asserted the right to self-determination, which was a form of New World African nationalism. Charleston AME Church became an indispensable institution for Vesey to organize African people, to develop a political ideology, to create a revolutionary Christian doctrine. It was this social and political climate, Stuckey explains, that helped Vesey formulate how to Pan-Africanize his movement. So here's an excerpt. In the Vesey conspiracy, the very process by which Africans were being transformed into a single people is revealed. Vesey surrounded himself with lieutenants from several African ethnic groups. Monday Gel and Igbo, Mingo Hearth, and Mandingo, Gullah Jack, and Angolan, right? His choice of leaders from different African peoples was designed to maximize cooperation among elements further. Apparently, the movements of such elements was considerable. The conspiracy gave direct political expression to the values found in the folklore of South Carolina blacks, one in which Igbo and Congo Angolan influences were considerable. How come that's not talked about? How come that's not talked about? KW.7 says they are, meaning ADOS and FBA, are a derivative group, but will not gain power disavowing Africa. Absolutely. Right? But how come this Vesey conspiracy isn't talked about more? Right? And is the Vesey conspiracy really an example of the Africans becoming a changed people, in your opinion? I'll be curious to hear from you guys who are live with me. Do you think the Vesey conspiracy is an example of how Africans, enslaved Africans in America, became a changed people? Especially when you read the details of what he did, right? Stuckey goes on to examine the religious values of enslaved Africans accepting Christianity. Many Africans in Charleston adopting Christianity revolutionized it through the larger African values and folklore that were pervasive in their surroundings. Stuckey concludes that many of the cultural influences of whites on enslaved Africans did not totally affect their Africanicity. Quote, on the contrary, the most acculturated slaves, like generally, appropriated values from the larger environment and relied on African values that pointed the way to creative solutions to a variety of problems, cultural and political. It was that kind of innovative genius that helped create a new form of African nationalism in Charleston. Folklore nationalism that will lead Stuckey further to conclude that, quote, in the conspiracy, African nationalism provided the thrust toward autonomy, for diverse African peoples were represented and bent their efforts in pursuit of independence from their oppressors. Although the Vesey insurrection was betrayed by enslaved Africans who did not understand the importance of African liberation, Stuckey suggests it may have yet had an influence on David Walker. You see that line right there? An enslaved African did not understand the importance of African liberation. We have a lot of those today in leadership positions on the continent. We have those today who don't understand that, who are from Caribbean nations like Haiti, right? Yesterday, Pro-Black Perspective mentioned this tweet that I saw. I'm going to be cool and I'm not going to call the name. I'm not going to show the tweet. Of a Haitian who's saying, basically, ignore this idea of the Chinese boogeyman. We need China to come into Haiti and help us. Hmm. And all I could do was shake my head at that. That's an African who doesn't understand the importance of African liberation. The idea that you would willingly invite the Asians, the Chinese, to come and quote unquote help you is just ridiculous. All right, but that's what we have in 2021. And it's from people who you would think would be kind of in line with the Africans who did understand the importance of African liberation. We have an understanding problem, and we've long had an understanding problem, right? We have as a group, we have too much folks who don't understand, and we've had it going on for way too long now. We've had it going on for way too long. To continue, Stuckey suggests it may yet have had an influence on David Walker. In chapter 2 of Slave Culture, entitled David Walker in Defense of African Rights and Liberty, Sterling Stuckey reiterates his long-held belief that Walker was one of the greatest ideologists of African liberation in the 19th century. Stuckey goes on to examine the life of Walker and the ideological concepts of the appeal, and writes an excellent analysis of Walker's critique of capitalism, slavery, land reparations, the American colonization society, and Pan-Africanism. All right. So someone earlier mentioned that the Back to Africa movement was in the 1800s before Garvey. They're referring to, I believe they're referring to the American colonization society. All right. Again, I want to remind you guys, listen to the revolutionary matron in the pinned comment in the chat. You can check out recent episodes of revolutionary matron doing a deep reading of David Walker's appeal. I suggest you check that out, right? As well as, check out what the pro-black perspective has been talking about during this month's reading. All right, the pro-black perspective says boogeyman tweet. He has a sad face. Yeah, it's some nonsense. I saw it and almost gave a harsh critique of it, and I was like, the sister has been seemingly solid in past conversations. I'm gonna back off, but I saw Only to say did kind of comment on it. All right. Let me take a quick station ID. I'll be back on the other side.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Yes, indeed. Make sure to check out those shows as well as the Revolutionary Matron, all right, on KWAZ Radio. And just to continue that lack of understanding thing I was saying a second ago, when you lack the fundamental understanding, any other ideology can get in your way. So when they talk about Vesey and them were undermined by an African who lacked understanding, some people ain't gonna like it, but I could bet that African was a Christian, a staunch Christian, and that person just upended that whole move right there. Right? However, To continue, however, I have chosen to examine 4 other important issues of Stuckey's exegesis of Walker from a black nationalist perspective. First, in black slave culture, Stuckey changes his earlier position of Walker, calling for the establishment of an all-black nation in the ideological origins of black nationalism. Second, he identifies a sub-theme of a hope for interracial harmony in the appeal, upon which he is in agreement with those who criticize him for not giving enough attention to this skeptical vision of Walker's of racial amity in America. Third, his analysis of the appeal in slave culture appears to cross over into Wilson J. Moses's black Germanic analysis that Walker's appeal is an example of the constant warnings issued by blacks to whites concerning the judgment that was to come from the sin of slavery. You know, I find that so laughable. I find that appeal and all MLK and M's appeal, I find that so laughable. It's a wonder more people weren't telling these guys in their lifetime, like, dude, what are you talking about? Right? In Black Messiahs and Uncle Tom, social and literary manipulations of a religious myth. Fourth, I examine Stuckey's critique of Walker's neglect of African folklore in America. Before examining Stuckey's analysis, it is important to this point to recognize that one may express black nationalist sentiments, but at the same time be an advocate for racial coexistence. Let me read that again. Before examining Stuckey's analysis, it is important at this point to recognize that one may express black nationalist sentiments, but at the same time be an advocate for racial coexistence. For example, Frederick Douglass many times expressed black nationalist tenets, such as the need for African Americans to unite as a people, to fight racism, and the right to self-determination. At the same time, Douglass, like Walker, desired to live in a society where free Africans and white Americans could exist as a nation. This is totally different from one who advocates black nationalism based on racial and geographical boundaries. For example, Martin Delany in the 1850s advocated the formation of a real nation state based on racial and geographical boundaries. Because of the harsh racism he witnessed in America, he desired to separate totally from white Americans. As earlier examined, Stuckey once believed Walker called for the establishment of a black nation, a black hegemony, and that Walker stressed the need for African people to rule themselves. However, in slave culture, Stuckey considers that Walker never thought of a separate black nation. So this is an excerpt. In a moment of stern prophecy, Walker added, quote, "Every dog must have its day. The Americans is coming to an end." Furthermore, he predicted that the enslaved children of Africa will have, in spite of all their enemies, to take a stand among the nations of the earth, end of quote. It is possible that in this formulation, Walker envisioned the destruction of whites, leaving blacks in the position of governance in America. If so, his faith in a God favoring the oppressed accounts for that apocalyptic vision. There is no indication that he thought a separate nation desirable along or within the boundaries of white America. When you guys who are here with me right now read the appeal, or after you've listened to the Revolutionary Matron's deep reading of the appeal, do you think Walker wanted a separate black nation? Do you think Walker advocated for a separate black nation? To continue, Sterling Stuckey now believes that Walker never thought of a separate nation along or within America. Then this indicates a shift from his earlier analysis in the introduction to the ideological origins of black nationalism. Furthermore, Walker's apocalyptic prophecy of the destruction of whites by God makes a strong case for the Germaniatic warning and consequences Wilson J. Moses attributes to the appeal. Stuckey essentially says that Walker believed in a humanity that did not favor one ethnic group over the other. Oh boy. Here's an excerpt. In the end, Walker did not place the desire for a separate state over that for his people in America. To reject the latter option, if available, would be to succumb to the virus of racism that infected the American nation. He gave primacy to values, to the quality of human character, over considerations of color. All right. The last two analyses are not only a departure from the belief that Walker called for his brethren to create an all-black nation, they also refute those scholars who contend Stuckey does not conceptualize that Walker believed in the possibility of a society where free Africans and Euro-Americans to coexist. Stuckey not only believes this of Walker, but contends that it was very important to quote, to be sure, though treated in brief compass, the possibility of whites and blacks living in harmony is an important sub-theme in the appeal. It must be stressed that Stuckey believes Walker fought for the liberation of African people to have the right to self-determination and to define who they were against a government and a society that did not care about their best interests as a people. He states, quote, a central theme in the appeal is the indispensability of unified struggle by blacks for them to be free and defend their freedom, end of quote. Stuckey appears to agree with Moses's Jeremitic critique of the appeal, and furthermore continues to address Walker's skeptical allowance for the possibility of racial amity. Here's an excerpt. While he thought such harmony possible with God's intercession, he considered the vital destruction of white America more likely, which explains his not dwelling on a relationship of mutual respect between whites and blacks. The burden of the appeal is essentially one of doom for whites. Yet the fact that Walker gave attention to the possibility of harmonious relations between whites and blacks must be taken seriously, because the search for freedom and readiness to consider changing realities, the interests of that search were both important to him. So right there you have a problem. Right, there's a problem of this duality, and perhaps even of a dual consciousness, in that you're warning America of their destruction, but at the same time, it'll be cool if we could all live together. If I'm calling down for fire and brimstone on Euro America, on white America, I don't want to be living nowhere near these people. If you believe that a Most High God will come and destroy these folks for what they've done, why would you want to live among them? Unless surely you want to be destroyed too. And it's that kind of stuff that really takes me out of some of, the older ideologies, right? It really takes me out of it. Anyway, to continue, while Stuckey contends that the appeal is without a doubt a black nationalist document, he does not believe it advocated a form of black nationalism founded on racial separatism. But he maintains that all of Walker's writings are black nationalist formulations that will be later advocated throughout the 19th and 20th century. This is an excerpt. He is the precursor of a long line of advocates of African freedom, extended all the way to Paul Robeson and Malcolm X of our time. He is the father of black nationalist theory in America, because much of the substance of the ideology is found in his writings, despite the sometimes disjointed way in which he presented his views. let me say this too. If your foundation is shaky, then a lot of what's built upon that foundation will itself be shaky. And so now we can kind of understand the shakiness in ideologies that we've seen, you know, throughout the 19th and 20th century. And Chaka 97 is in the room saying peace. Right? Where's the Rico Cooper photography when you need him? Right? No, I'm kidding. Peace to him, Chaka 97. Thanks for joining us. All right. So I just want to point that out. All right. The views for which people build upon, you really have to look at those views critically. Stuckey also asserts that Walker's belief in cooperating with white Americans was a harbinger to the ideology of Malcolm X after his break the Nation of Islam, ideology which, quote, was rooted mainly in recognition of the need for blacks to combat those forces within their ranks that contributed to self-hatred and disunity, which was something of an original formula. End of quote. To Malcolm X, there could be no possible cooperation with white Americans until there was unity among people of African descent. Stuckey points out that Walker's dream of a unified African people is an important issue in black nationalist theory. He writes, Walker's interest in friendship and love amongst blacks, a central theme in nationalist thought, was related to his recognition of their need of self-confidence, which would help them, among other things, refute white assertions of black inferiority on the deepest level possible. Stuckey postulates that black nationalist theory, in its truest, richest form, is found in African slave folklore, and that Walker was the leading advocate of nationalism among free Africans during his lifetime. However, it is very disappointing that Walker never appreciated the genius of African culture of the enslaved people whom he identified with in the appeal. KW Dawn 7 says, the people who believe fire and brimstone will hit Urugu believe that they'll be taken up in a rapture prior to that event happening. Good luck with that. Good luck with that. Taken up. Good luck. David Walker, like many freedom fighters before and after him, was influenced by Anglo-Saxon cultural values. The Anglo-Saxon influence of Christianity blinded him to the importance of religion in Africa. More than likely, Walker was not able to understand the quote African sorrow songs, quote unquote African sorrow songs, in their cultural context that Du Bois wrote about in the souls of black folks. He also never conceptualized Du Bois's cultural nationalism that appeared at the end of the 19th century. Walker's failure to Africanize his idea of Christianity was a big ideological setback for the struggle of freedom. Let me read that again. Walker's failure to Africanize his idea of Christianity was a big ideological setback for the struggle of freedom. You can't be out here trying to Africanize European philosophy, especially when you have your own African philosophy. Stuckey explains, failing even to acknowledge the existence of slave culture, though he had been exposed to it, he had little alternative to denouncing most of what he saw in Afro-American life as a tragic byproduct of slavery and African backwardness. Whew. He also suggests, despite his profound identification with the slaves, he did not understand the value system that enriched their spiritual life, the art that functioned in terms of spiritual imperatives. Stuckey continues to make another valid criticism of the importance of Walker not appreciating African culture in America during his lifetime. So here's another excerpt. Walker's pride in blackness, his respect for the achievements of blacks in the ancient world, and his belief in African moral character and the need for African autonomy provided elements of cultural nationalism. As important as those views were, they did not go far enough. For people must be nourished by values in the present, as well as by those in the past. This was ironic, for even as the larger society's impact on black people was a continuing oppressive reality, black culture was, for all the horrors of oppression, flourishing in several forms and destined to have a major impact on world culture in the 20th century. But that line that they read right there, for people must be nourished by values in the present as well as those in the past. I think there's a large group within African consciousness, within the conscious society, that only dwell on the past and don't give it a relevance in the present. And I think that hurts us too. I think that hurts us a lot too, right? Because as we've talked about on this show many times before, the African value system, if you brought that to these youths out here today, from young kids, and you made that a part of their education, we'll see a difference in how these folks, especially these youths out here, carry themselves. And the importance for them to carry themselves better is not to look better in anyone's eyes but our own eyes. And more importantly, it's to allow ourselves to flourish. You know, I talked about it before. You know, the idea that, you know, black folks will do the most depraved things and sell the most depraved items in their own communities. You know what's also a bad byproduct of that too? When you do those dirty dealings in the society or in an area of society, right? So let's say you do that. I'm in Brooklyn. Let's say you do that. You're doing dirt in the area that they now call Little Caribbean, right? When you bring that nonsense to the area, you make it bad for everyone who lives there. You make it bad for everyone who wants to come and do business there. People who want to start businesses and build in that neighborhood. Who wants to go to a neighborhood, right? To a block, for example, right? That if you accidentally wear your favorite color, which is red, you could lose your life, or at the very least get pressured by youths in the area because of this choice of color, right? And then what we will do as black folks, and this is why we got to take control of this stuff, we will then complain that there's no resources in the neighborhood. Well, what resources are going to come in the neighborhood and do positive stuff in the neighborhood? Let's say I decide I want to go and, you know, start doing some tutoring in coding and arts or whatever, right? In the neighborhood. I open up a little space, a little center, and I'm coming in with computers now to set up in this, and I get robbed of the computers. Who wants that? That stuff hurts us. People don't want to come back to that shit and do stuff. So we really gotta start getting this value system, our value system, into our youth early on, so that wherever we are, we can be better off than we currently are, right? To continue, Walker may have been influenced by Anglophilic values, but his spirit of resistance to oppression, his desire for pan-African struggle throughout the diaspora, and his timely analysis deconstructing American democratic theory and social behavior was indeed against the spirit of white supremacy. Stuckey affirms, quote, his critique is original in character, providing a departure and a rival for proponents of African liberation. David Walker was one of the greatest ideologists of African liberation during the 19th century. End of quote. But is Stuckey's conceptualization of Walker as the progenitor Black nationalist theory in Africa valid? Though scholars may continue to debate this, it would seem hard to disprove that later advocates of Black nationalism in America, who advocated a separate nation state based on geographical boundaries during the 19th and 20th centuries, would not have been able to trace certain ideological concepts to Walker's writings. Stuckey's interpretation of the Appeal as a theoretical Black nationalist document is a polemical crux for some scholars who aver that David Walker's desire to live in a multicultural America. Those who share this view must consider that Stuckey does not limit his discourse on the Appeal to Black nationalism narrowly defined, but rather to a range of sentiments and concerns. Stuckey's concept of a Black nationalist theory, rooted in African slave folklore in America, is an original and pioneering one, and his intellectual insights are valuable to a progressive rewriting African-American history and culture. That concludes the paper. What did you guys think of that paper? By the way, in your readings of other thought leaders in our past, who have you read that's referenced? Who have you read that's referenced Delaney often? Or, or ask another way, who have you read amongst the thought leaders of our past and present, who has referenced Delaney, Walker the most? Right? KW Dawn 7 says it is a supernatural fantasy. Yeah, the idea that when fire and brimstone hits these white folks, you would have been spared is just goofy to me. Right? It's goofy to me. Right? While I wait for the folks to answer that question, let me do my last station ID before we sign out tonight.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-Black perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Yes, indeed. The pro-Black perspective says no one really references anyone. I find that wild. And now that I sit here and think about it, I find that wild. No one really references anyone. That's interesting. That's interesting. In any event, that's the end of the paper. We're going to sign out here. Again, look at the pinned comment in the chat. That will take you to the Revolutionary Matron. That's the new show on KWAZ Radio. That will take you to the Revolutionary Matron's, the beginnings of her deep reading of David Walker's Appeal. Right? You guys make sure check that out. Make sure like the content, subscribe to that channel, and do that, and do the same for all the other shows on the network. I will be back on Thursday, I'm hoping. I think I need to get a tooth pulled, so we'll see when that happens and how available I'll be. But until next time, you guys be good. Check out the Pro-Black Perspective tomorrow morning, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'll be in the chat room most likely, more than likely, and I'll see you later. Peace.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.